Carlos Ghosn, a name once lauded amongst the world's captains of industry. The Brazilian-born businessman quickly rose through the ranks of the automobile industry to become the CEO of several global companies, to include Michelin's North American branch, Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi Motors. It was, however, his time spent as the head of Nissan that saw Ghosn rise to global fame, when he took the company from bankruptcy to financial success once more. In time, he would chair the powerful Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance and bring the group to a 10% global market share. Then suddenly, Ghosn's world turned upside down as he touched down in a private plane to Tokyo International Airport late in the afternoon of November 19, 2018. Ghosn was met by Tokyo district prosecutors, who immediately took him into custody. Shortly after, his top aide Greg Kelly was also arrested when arriving back home to Japan after a trip in the US. Hours later, Nissan's chief executive Hiroto Sakawa called a press conference and revealed that Ghosn had been dismissed from Nissan's board of directors, and that he would be subsequently stripped of all executive rights. The financial world was shocked. What in the world could have happened to have a man known as Mr. Fix-It for his miraculous turnarounds of troubled companies fall so far and so fast from grace? The answer would come soon enough, and for those who understood Japanese business culture, they wouldn't be very surprising. Ghosn had been the target of an internal Nissan investigation in cooperation with Japanese police when suspicions arose over his misuse of company funds. As the investigation dragged on, a laundry list of financial misdeeds was discovered, all centered around the use of Nissan funds for Ghosn's personal gain. To avoid public embarrassment in the shame-sensitive nation of Japan, Nissan worked to limit the details of that investigation with the public. But what came to light was a deep culture of corruption by Ghosn and his top aide, who both worked to hide their misuse of company funds from other top executives. Ghosn allegedly manipulated Nissan's record-keeping to hide the fact that he was using the company to pay some or all of the costs of his $18 million residences in Rio de Janeiro, Beirut, Paris, and Amsterdam. He also routinely charged all family vacation expenses directly to the company, and given his expensive tastes, this wasn't a budget trip to the local water park. We're talking millions and gallivanting around the world, all on the company dime. Ghosn had talked Nissan into setting up a shell company, ZA Capital, to be used to make venture investments around the end of 2010, and this company became his own personal piggy bank. To hide his activities, Ghosn created an elaborate chain of shell companies that handled the money ZA Capital was investing in various venture enterprises. The long chain of shell companies stymied the efforts of Nissan auditors to track ZA's activities and hid Ghosn's spending spree from the company. In total, somewhere around $15 to $20 million in property alone was purchased by Ghosn on the company dime. Buying property and taking off for luxury vacations around the world wasn't enough for Ghosn though, and that's because one specific aspect of Japanese CEO culture particularly chafed the rich Brazilian businessman. In Japanese culture, CEOs are not the sociopathic, greedy, aggressive, intimidating figures that they usually are in the rest of the world, or at least they're not supposed to be. Japanese CEO culture strives for a sense of humility and modesty, and thus Japanese CEOs are not paid nearly as lavishly as those from other nations. For Ghosn, this was unacceptable. To hell with humility, Ghosn needed to get paid. And get paid he did. With the aid of his confidant Greg Kelly, Ghosn created a series of very complicated deferred payment plans, which were hidden from financial reports and amounted to Ghosn giving himself a bonus of around $80 million. For those keeping track, this brought Ghosn's additional compensation to about $100 million, though the full figure is still a mystery, as Nissan fights very hard to keep that embarrassing secret from leaking out. As if that wasn't enough, Ghosn then shifted the tab for a personal investment loss of $16.6 million directly to the company, because when you're a greedy scam artist, apparently you can't help yourself. But wait, you might say, wasn't Ghosn responsible for turning around struggling automakers and leading one of the largest companies in the world? Maybe he deserved more than the modest salary that Japanese CEO culture afforded him. A man should be rewarded for his hard work after all. Well, you'd be right in saying that a man should be rewarded for their talent and hard work, which is why Ghosn was, at the time of his initial arrest in 2018, earning almost $17 million a year as one of the world's top-paid auto executives. You know, maybe Ghosn was right in stealing around $100 million from Nissan. A man can barely make ends meet at $17 million a year. Ghosn was held under arrest for several days and was about to be released on bail when news of an additional $8 million he had stolen through yet another shell company surfaced. He was once more put back in jail pending a bail hearing, an act that he protested. His wife also wrote a letter to the Human Rights Watch protesting his treatment, because everyone knows that a rich person sitting in jail constitutes a grave violation of human rights. Ghosn was worth tens of millions of dollars, and yet forced to sit in jail for having stolen over $100 million, rubbing shoulders with common criminals. This was an Avengers-level human rights threat. Despite Ghosn's wife's passionate plea to the world community that Ghosn's human rights were being violated by being forced to sit in jail for his crime, the Japanese legal system said, "Bye, girl," and denied a bail hearing until early March. Ghosn was forced to sit in jail for almost a month in total over 2 separate arrests before being allowed bail. Remember that next time you hear of someone going to jail for years over a drug possession charge. Ghosn's arrest prompted other companies he had worked with to take a second look at their own finances, because maybe Mr. Fix-It wasn't just fixing their companies, but his pocket on their dime as well. An investigation by Renault revealed 11 million euro of questionable expenses by Ghosn, and the French government opened a separate investigation into Ghosn. Distraught over the possibility of actually having her husband be held accountable for the theft of 100 million and counting dollars, Ghosn's wife made a passionate plea to French President Emmanuel Macron to intercede on their behalf during a meeting with Japan's Shinzo Abe. Macron replied with a simple, "Girl, bye," and declined. Ghosn knew his goose was cooked. He would be facing the possibility of prison for his theft, a realization that sent shockwaves amongst the world's elite and rich. He had to do something, and do it fast because the noose was closing in on him. Any day now, he could be carted off to prison from his house arrest in his luxurious home. But that wouldn't happen because Ghosn had come up with a plan. Well, when we say plan, we actually mean more that he came up with a series of Scooby-Doo-like events that only an insanely rich person could possibly pull off. Ghosn's escape would turn out to be less of a masterminded Ocean's 11 escape plot and more of a series of shenanigans financed by a whole lot of dough. First, Ghosn decided to throw himself a party and hired musicians to come play at his home. Watched by police authorities 24/7, Ghosn wasn't allowed to leave his home for any reason and had been forced to surrender all of his passports. Well, all except for that second copy of his passport that he was forced by law to have on his person, because in Japan all foreigners must have legal identification at all times. This would prove to be a bit of an oversight on Japan's part, who seriously underestimated how badly Ghosn didn't want to pay for his crimes and the Looney Tunes-like measures he would take to ensure that. After the musicians finished playing, Ghosn excused himself to a room in his house where the musicians had been storing their gear. There, he climbed into a large musical instrument case and had his accomplices seal him inside with a breathing hole for air. Then Ghosn was simply wheeled out of his house, loaded into the back of a van, and driven away, all directly under the noses of the watching police officers who didn't realize that they were in a cartoon sketch and should have been looking inside instrument cases for a would-be fugitive. Ghosn was then driven inside his instrument case to a remote airport in a small town and loaded onto a private plane. The exact details of Ghosn's escape are unclear though, and some sources state that Ghosn may have sneaked out of his home and met 2 men at a hotel. Then the men and Ghosn took a bullet train to Osaka and checked into a hotel near Kansai International Airport. A few hours later, Ghosn was shoved into a large container and wheeled to the airport, where the box he was in couldn't fit into an X-ray machine and thus it was never checked. Seeing as Ghosn's box was headed for an international flight on a private jet, airport security probably didn't bother opening the box. Way to go, Japan airport security. From there, all that's known is that Ghosn flew on a private jet to Istanbul and then left on a second private jet to Beirut. Once Ghosn was in Lebanon, Japan immediately requested Interpol issue a red notice for his arrest. Though since no extradition treaty exists between Japan and Lebanon, arrest is extremely unlikely unless Ghosn leaves the country. For his part, Ghosn made a public plea claiming he was a political asylum seeker as he was being unfairly targeted by Japan's cruel justice system for the simple crime of stealing $100 million. Ghosn claimed he fled injustice and political persecution, which only a really rich person who stole $1/10 billion would have the balls to do. Lebanon has instituted a travel ban on Ghosn though. To date, there seems to be no consequences for the 100 million and counting in theft that Ghosn carried out over the last decade. Because, you know, rich people. Now that you've finished our story on how consequences don't exist if you're rich enough, why not check out this other video? Or maybe you'd prefer this other one instead. It won't cost you a dime, so check one of them out now.